In 1984, a 19-year-old hardware store employee named Jim was walking from one end of the store to the other when he noticed something odd in one of the aisles. He stopped and stared at it for a second, not really sure what to make of it, before turning around and walking back where he came from to start telling staff and customers that they should evacuate. Little did Jim know, it was already too late, and in a matter of seconds, that building was going to turn into a living hell. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please peel all of the bananas in the 5-star review buttons home, but don't take a bite out of any of them. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen's podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was October 10th, 1984, in the small California town of South Pasadena. And for 17-year-old Jimmy Satina, the big news that day was the national sporting event that was going on just 2 hours south at the Jack Murphy Stadium in San Diego. There, California's San Diego Padres baseball team was playing the second game in the World Series against the Detroit Tigers. Not that Jimmy could even watch the game on TV. When the first pitch was thrown at 5:30 p.m. local time, Jimmy was working his part-time shift at Ollie's Home Center, a popular family-owned hardware store located in a strip mall on Fair Oaks Avenue, just one town south of Jimmy's home. But Jimmy didn't need to see the baseball game to enjoy it. He could listen to it on the radio and envision everything that was going on. Set to graduate next spring, Jimmy was himself an exceptional baseball player. And while he never bragged about any of his accomplishments, every student and teacher at Pasadena's Blair High School knew that the friendly and popular star center fielder was being scouted by the Chicago Cubs professional baseball team. And as much as Jimmy might have liked to be watching tonight's ball game, he needed his job at Ollie's, and it would never have even occurred to him to miss a single shift or call in sick or leave early. As one of 7 siblings, Jimmy had spent years collecting empty bottles and cans so he could use the deposit money to buy his own sports equipment. Now, this regular gig in Ollie's houseware department that he'd started almost exactly 1 year ago meant that he'd be able to do more than just buy baseball cleats and gloves and bats. These days, he earned enough money to help out his whole family. With his paycheck from Ollie's, Jimmy would soon be able to purchase the car insurance policy they needed to get the used Volkswagen that was parked in their backyard back out on the road. Still, when Jimmy looked up at the wall clock, he was happy to see that it was already 7:30 p.m. If all went well, he'd be home in about an hour or so. Then he and his older brother could talk baseball. And around the same time that Jimmy was glancing at the clock inside the houseware department, a middle-aged couple and their 2.5-year-old grandson were just pulling into the strip mall parking lot outside of Ollie's. Like Jimmy inside, Billy and Ada Deal, the middle-aged couple who had just pulled up, they also knew the hardware store would be closing soon, so they told their grandson, Matthew, that he'd need to wait until after they were done their shopping before they could stop for ice cream at a nearby Baskin-Robbins ice cream parlor. To save time, the grandfather, Billy, would go by himself to the lumber department for the lengths of wood he needed to complete a small home repair project, and his wife, the grandmother, 50-year-old Ada, would take Matthew to the paint department. A few minutes later, as Ada pushed Matthew in the shopping cart along the aisles lined with paint cans, 26-year-old Carolyn Krause looked up from her workstation in the paint department and smiled as she heard William chatting in toddler talk to his grandmother. Carolyn, who was married to a lieutenant in the Los Angeles Police Department, had 2 children of her own, a 3-year-old son and a 2-year-old daughter. Now, Carolyn also glanced at her watch. Her own mother was taking care of her 2 children while Carolyn was at work. But her mom would be stopping by in just a few minutes to pick up the keys to Carolyn's house so she could put the 2 kids to bed. Carolyn pushed her blonde hair back behind her ears. She thought maybe she heard the little boy in the shopping cart say the words ice cream. Carolyn smiled as she pulled the house keys out of her purse and slipped them into her pocket to give to her mom. Over in the hardware department of Ollie's Home Goods, 19-year-old Jim Obdam had worked one of the longest shifts of anyone at the store that day. He'd arrived during the day and was staying on into the evening until the store closed. Like Jimmy Satina, Jim Obdam would be glad to get home and catch up on the World Series. The San Diego Padres had lost the first game the night before, but Jim was betting that the Padres would even the score that evening. Just after 8 p.m., Jim Ogden heard a muffled announcement over the store's public address system. He couldn't understand the words, but that was nothing new or surprising. The sound from the speakers was low quality, and it always echoed in the big open space of the store, which was about 1/3 the size of a football field. And Jim was headed to the front of the store anyway, so if there was any news he needed to know, he'd find out soon one way or another. But before Jim could reach the south-facing entrance, he looked sideways into one of the aisles, vaguely aware of something that seemed out of place. That's when he noticed a column of dark smoke in the air that must be rising from one of the display racks. Right away, Jim veered off to his right towards the paint department. He wasn't feeling afraid of the smoke. If there was a fire, it must be a small one that they could extinguish very quickly, and he could already see customers heading towards the exit. But in case that muffled announcement had been an evacuation order, Jim wanted to make sure that all the customers in the store, along with the staff, knew they had to get out. It shouldn't take long, not this close to the time when the store was closing anyway, but he knew how reluctant a lot of people could be to just walk away from a cart full of items they hadn't had a chance to buy yet. So when Jim saw Carolyn at her workstation in the paint department, he just asked her quickly if there were any customers still in her department, and right away she jumped up and told him she would go check. After that, Jim headed towards the hardware department, where he instructed a few customers who were looking at tools to get out as quickly as possible. And that was when he saw a middle-aged woman pushing a small boy who was seated inside of her shopping cart. It was Ada Deal and her grandson Matthew. When Ada didn't respond right away to Jim's request that she and the little boy exit the store immediately, Jim spoke again to Ada, but this time with a little more authority in his voice. "You should probably leave the cart right here," he told the woman. "Just take the child out of his seat in the cart and follow me." And then Jim turned, leading them towards the nearest exit. Jim still wasn't too worried about the smoke he'd just seen, especially since that was all he'd seen, just smoke and no fire. But that changed a moment later when he turned around, and for a few seconds, his brain could not even process what he was seeing. In a matter of minutes, the column of smoke he had seen earlier had turned into a literal wall of flame. And a moment after that, the fire behind him seemed to take off across the ceiling overhead, and the air around him was suddenly so hot it felt like his skin was on fire too. Then Jim heard the heavy steel fire door starting to come down from the ceiling behind him, and Jim felt a jolt of pure fear race through him. Those floor-to-ceiling barriers were only programmed to roll down in the event of a catastrophic fire, one so hot and already so completely out of control that it had already melted the locks in the regular doors. The purpose of this steel fire barricade was to segment the space inside of the open building and confine a fire, especially one that started outside of business hours when the building was empty, to just one part of the building. But if those doors were coming down now, while staff and customers were inside, the barricades cut off access to the fire emergency exits around the edges of the building that led to the outside. Jim had been told that these barricades had doors on them that allowed people to go through them, but with the smoke and the heat in the air all around them, Jim wondered how on earth anyone could find those doors if they were trapped on the wrong side of the barricade. And as Jim is thinking about this, he realized he was all alone. The woman and the little boy she was with, they were nowhere to be seen. A second later, there was a popping noise and the lights in the building went out. When Ada's husband, Billy, heard the muffled announcement come over the public address system at 8 p.m., he was still in the lumber department picking out the 2x4s he planned to buy. Billy could not make out the words he was hearing, but when he looked at his watch and saw the time, he automatically assumed that customers were being reminded that the store was about to close. And Billy could already see people starting to head for the front of the store, some of them just leaving their carts behind them. And even after a young man jumped down from a forklift truck he'd been operating and yelled, "My God, it's a fire!" It was like Billy's mind refused to believe it. Billy felt like nothing could be wrong. He didn't see a fire, and he certainly didn't smell any smoke. But a moment later, Billy saw several people running through a fire door and heading in his direction. Billy took a few quick steps forward until he could actually see through this fire door into the west side of the building. And when he saw the huge cloud of dark smoke, he had only one thought. Where was his wife and grandson? Turning around, Billy ran as fast as he could towards the opposite fire door, the one closest to where he knew Ada and Matthew had been shopping. But when he looked behind him, just a few seconds later, back towards that fire door, the cloud of smoke that he had seen had somehow turned into a raging column of flames licking from floor to ceiling. As Billy screamed Ada's name, he was praying that his wife and grandson had already left, heading out to safety through the same front doors they'd used to enter Ole's just 30 minutes earlier. But when Billy looked outside those doors now, all he could see were the flashing lights of a fire truck that had just pulled up to the curb. A few minutes after 8 p.m., when Jim Obden staggered out of the home center through one of the emergency exits, he was covered in soot from the smoke and fire, and his arms, neck, and ears had suffered second and third-degree burns. After the lights had gone out, Jim Obden had fallen to his hands and knees, and choking on the smoke in the air, he'd crawled along a wall until, by pure luck, he'd found an emergency fire exit and gotten outside. Now, dazed and disoriented, Jim touched one hand to his wrist, wondering why his skin was so hot. But the skin he touched just peeled right off his arm and fell to the ground. By the time the first 6 firefighters had jumped off engine 81, flames were hissing and rolling out from under the southeast door of Ole's Home Goods. On the 3-block drive from the fire station to the hardware store, all the fire captain had seen at the roofline where Ole's was located had been a thin blanket of haze. That sight had reassured the captain, and he had relaxed a little bit. The fact that he couldn't see any glow of fire or buildup of smoke over the store location made him think that this was probably a dumpster or nuisance fire, not a structural fire that could do serious damage to the building or anyone who had been inside. But once on site, the fire captain knew he'd been totally wrong. And when Billy Deal, Ada's husband and Matthew's grandfather, ran over to the captain shouting that his wife and grandson might still be inside the burning building, the fire captain instantly began preparing for a rescue attempt, still confident that his team could save anyone who was just 10 feet inside of the building. But as soon as the captain and his men entered that southwest door, all they saw was a blinding inferno. In just 7 minutes, the fire at Ole's Home Center had flashed up from the ground level across the ceiling of the interior space, and the heat from the overhead flames had been so intense that it set practically everything in the store below on fire in an instant. The captain radioed for help. He needed more engines and more firefighters. But after repeating that the request was top priority, the captain could not believe his ears when he heard dispatch send one responding engine off in the wrong direction. What he didn't know at that time was that another fire had erupted at a grocery market just 6 blocks away, at almost the exact same time as the emergency call had come in from Ole Hardware Store. And it would turn out that an hour and 15 minutes before that, a similar fire had erupted 7 miles north of Ole's at yet another food market, this one in Pasadena. By the time the first arson investigator arrived at Ole's, he had just enough time to start snapping pictures of the fire before the 1-acre roof in the center of the building caved in and a torrent of fire and sparks suddenly lit up the night sky in the center of South Pasadena. Standing next to this investigator was Ada's husband, Billy. Long after the investigator was sent away to the second fire just a few blocks away from Ole's, Billy would remain waiting in the parking lot of Strip Mall for the next 22 hours. Before the night was over, it would take 32 separate fire engine companies and 125 firefighters to put out the blaze at Ole's. Early on the afternoon of October 11th, less than 24 hours after the first fire truck had arrived at Ole's Home Center, the investigation into the cause of the fire was called to a sudden halt. Arson investigators from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, as well as from the California State Fire Marshal's office, had all arrived on the scene early that morning. These investigators are trained to look at what is left behind after a fire is put out and figure out whether and how the fire might have been started on purpose, a crime known as arson. Once at Ole's, the 6-person team, armed with shovels and wheelbarrows, spent the next several hours searching for human remains and trying to figure out where and how the fire had started. All around them, bulldozers and skip loaders were lifting, moving, and sorting through piles of blackened and smoking debris. But all that detective work instantly gave way to body recovery when workers in the northern section of the hardware store, far away from that first column of smoke that Jim Obden had spotted the night before, found their first charred human remains. At about 4 p.m. that afternoon, officials sifting through up to 2 feet of water and wreckage discovered the bodies of Oli employees Jimmy Satina and Carolyn Krause, both lying near one another just 7 feet from an emergency exit door. 50 minutes later, and about 40 feet away in the northwest corner of the building, officials discovered the bodies of Ada Deal and her grandson Matthew. For Billy Deal, along with the families of Carolyn Krause and Jimmy Satina, this news was devastating. In the 22 hours that they had kept vigil in the strip mall parking lot, they had hoped against hope that by some miracle, their loved ones might have survived. In the week that followed, more than 1,200 people would attend the church service for 17-year-old Jimmy Satina, and 50-year-old Ada Deal and 2.5-year-old Matthew would be buried together in the same casket, the little boy cradled in his grandmother's arms. By late Thursday, October 11th, so one day after the most deadly fire in South Pasadena history had broken out at Oli's home center, investigators released a preliminary report on the cause of the blaze. According to lead investigator Jack Palmer, an arson cop and 25-year veteran of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, there was no evidence that the fire had been set deliberately. Instead, Sergeant Palmer theorized that the fire was accidental, and that its point of origin had been an electrical fire that started in the store attic. But not everyone who had examined the scene at Oli's on the day after the fire was fully on board with the official report. According to an investigator with the California State Fire Marshal's office, the fire had to have started somewhere inside the building close to the ground floor. And even though the fire itself had destroyed any real clues about its origin, Jim Allen was not ready to rule out the possibility of arson, and he filed his own report that listed the cause of fire as, quote, undetermined, end quote. And soon, the state fire marshal investigator had a very powerful ally who was even more vocal in disagreeing with the official line that the Oli fire was accidental. 35-year-old John Orr, the investigator who had stood next to Billy Deal in the parking lot on the night of the fatal fire, had straight out told the family of fire victim Carolyn Krause that he believed the fire was an act of arson. And John was someone whose opinion carried a lot of weight among firefighters and arson experts. After joining the Glendale Fire Department as a firefighter 10 years ago, John's ability to ferret out the causes of suspicious fires had eventually earned him his job as arson investigator. When John stepped back and looked at the events of October 10th, what he saw sounded all of his alarm bells. 3 fires at 3 retail stores, all during business hours? His own investigation into the 2 smaller fires at the grocery stores on October 10th had shown that they were most likely set deliberately in racks full of potato chips, an oil-saturated food that would catch fire and burn quickly. But even though there was no such point of origin at the Oli Home Center fire, and even though the Oli fire had been much, much more serious, John did not like what he considered a pattern among the 3 fires. So even after the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department closed the books on the Oli Home Center fire, John decided to keep digging. And a few days after the fatal Oli Home Center fire, Orr believed his suspicions were confirmed when arson investigators responded to a fire at the Building Emporium in North Hollywood. There, they found a low-tech but very effective time-delay incendiary device pushed into a stack of highly flammable polyfoam, a petroleum-based product used as stuffing in cushions and mattresses, that burns violently when it catches fire. The incendiary device was a piece of yellow-lined notebook paper wrapped around a cigarette and 3 unlit matches, the whole thing bundled together with a rubber band. Once the cigarette was lit, an arsonist would have up to about 15 minutes to flee the scene before the cigarette burned down and lit the matches, which then lit the notepaper on fire, which eventually lit the foam and created a raging fire. As John read through the report on the Building Emporium fire, he thought of the fire at Ollie's and how easy it might have been for an arsonist to have used that same low-tech incendiary device to set the fire that had claimed the lives of 4 people. But by then, the South Pasadena Home Center had been completely cleaned out, and it was just too late for John or anyone else to go back and look for any evidence that might support this new theory of how the Ollie's fire might have really started. But if John was right and the bundle of matches, cigarette, and notepaper began to show up at other fires, then he and his colleagues had a very scary problem on their hands. It was possible that arson investigators might find themselves hunting for a serial arsonist. But in the months that followed the devastating fire at Ollie's, it looked like maybe John was wrong. Over the next 3 years, the Glendale Fire Department in Southern California was plenty busy responding to emergency calls. But none of the brush fires, house fires, fires in retail stores, and empty buildings that John investigated between 1984 and 1987 matched the ferocity of the Ollie's Home Center fire and the 2 other fires that had all happened nearby and at almost the same time on that same evening of October 10th, 1984. But starting on January 13th, 1987, all that changed. Along a 100-mile stretch of Highway 99 between the cities of Fresno and Bakersfield, California, firefighters responded to more than half a dozen fires in the space of just 3 days. And like the Ollie's hardware fire of October 10th, 1984, all the fires occurred in retail stores during business hours, and all the fires appeared to have been set by placing an incendiary device in or near highly flammable foam rubber, styrofoam, or polyurethane. While there were no fatalities like there had been at Ollie's, these fires caused millions of dollars in damages. And at the scene of 4 of those fires, arson investigators found the same simple time delay device that John was now sure must have been used to start the Ollie fire: a piece of yellow-lined notebook paper wrapped around a cigarette and 3 unlit matches. But this time, John was not alone in voicing his suspicions that investigators might be dealing with a serial arsonist. John was now joined in that opinion by Captain Marvin G. Casey of the Bakersfield Fire Department, a 20-year veteran who carefully collected the evidence from each of the new arson scenes and sent it to the California Regional Office of the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives for testing. Even though the Bakersfield fires were way out of John's jurisdiction, John watched the cases carefully, glad that the person working them was taking the same approach he himself would have taken. And Captain Casey was even going so far as suggesting that the fires might be the work not only of a serial arsonist, but of an insider. Someone who seemed to know so much about the art of setting fires that he or she might even be a professional firefighter. And when the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Crime Lab came back with a report that it had discovered a partial fingerprint left on a scrap of yellow notebook paper found at the scene of one of the fires in the Bakersfield area, Marvin asked the fingerprint specialist at the office to run that print against the names of more than 200 of the state's arson investigators. But not only did the office turn down Marvin's request, there were just too many names on that list. The very idea that the fires could have been set by an actual investigator made Marvin an instant outcast among most of the state's tight-knit group of arson investigators. Meanwhile, the fingerprint failed to match any of the prints that were stored in a federal database of known criminals. And once again, if there was a serial arsonist at work, the trail went cold, just as it had a few years after the Ollie's Home Center fire back in 1984. But while John, along with Marvin, insisted on keeping the serial arsonist theory alive, their warnings seemed to fall on deaf ears. In fact, it would take 2 more waves of fires before law enforcement took the theories of John and Marvin seriously enough to set up a new task force to investigate these suspicious and destructive fires that had all broken out within that 2-year period. Calling itself the Pillow Pyro Task Force, this group of arson investigators targeted a criminal they now called, quote, a real pyro, end quote, someone with an uncontrollable need to set more fires. The first wave of fires that prompted the creation of this task force started on March 3, 1989 in Pacific Grove, California, 4 hours north of Bakersfield. That's when area fire departments responded to a series of 6 suspicious fires that all fit the profile of the Bakersfield fires of 1987, as well as the profiles of the fires that had all occurred at nearly the same time in South Pasadena on October 10, 1984, when the Ole Home Center fire claimed the lives of 4 people. Like those earlier fires, all the Pacific Grove fires happened in retail sites during business hours, and investigators again found evidence of the now familiar time delay incendiary device made from yellow notepaper, a cigarette, and unlit matches, all hidden inside the same highly flammable polyurethane materials. After this wave of fires, which caused millions in damages but no loss of human life, Marvin once again floated his theory that the arsons were the work of an insider, and now he handed a much shorter list of names of California arson investigators to the California Office of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, asking crime techs to compare that one partial print found back in 1987 on the scrap of yellow notepaper to the names of just 10 arson investigators. Those names represented investigators, which included himself and John, whose work may have taken them to both the Bakersfield and Pacific Grove areas during the times when the suspicious fires had occurred. But, once again, there were no matches, and even Marvin had to admit that his theory of the arsons being an inside job had hit a total dead end. But no sooner had the fires in Pacific Grove cooled off than Southern California was practically lit up by a series of 19 arsons or arson attempts that took place between late June 1990 and early March 1991. This 9-month-long wave began on June 27th with a brush fire that broke out in the College Hills area of Glendale, destroying 30 homes and severely damaging another 37 properties. And this time it was John who was called to the scene and who eventually uncovered evidence that the devastating College Hills fire had probably been caused by the incendiary device that was by now a signature of the serial arsonist that would soon be the quarry of the Special Pillow Pyro Task Force. More was yet to come in December when 7 retail stores in the Los Angeles and North Hollywood area went up in flames all within 3 weeks of each other, followed in March by 8 suspicious fires in Hollywood, 5 of them set on the same day, March 27th. But even after finding the signature incendiary device that John now believed traced all the way back to 1984 when Ole's Home Center burned to the ground, it wasn't until April 17, 1991, more than a year after the Pillow Pyro Task Force was formed, and 7 years after the fatal Ole's Home Center fire, that law enforcement finally got the tip that would eventually help them uncover the identity of one of the most prolific serial arsonists of the 20th century. But first, the Pillow Pyro Task Force had to catch their suspect red-handed, actually setting a fire or somehow revealing themselves as the arsonist. But, thanks to a series of human errors early on in the task force's attempts to mount a surveillance operation, catching their suspect in the act took much longer than anyone on the special task force ever expected. Because right after they got their first good piece of information, their suspect was seen stopping at a drugstore to buy cigarettes and matches. The task force surveillance team was horrified to see the suspect look under the back bumper of the car they were driving and discover the location tracking device that the surveillance team had installed to monitor and record their suspect's movements. After being in place for only just a couple of days, the device had come loose, and the suspect had quickly spotted the device antenna that was practically dragging on the ground. Now, not only was the suspect on notice that they were being watched, the publicity surrounding the devastating series of fires in College Hills seemed to have scared the arsonist into putting away their matches, cigarettes, and yellow-lined paper. And for the next several months, all investigators could really do to build their case was to show employees who had been working at the time of various arson fires that had taken place in the last 4 years to see if any of those employees could pick the suspect out of a photo lineup. Even John and his colleague Marvin, who had long suspected the presence of a serial arsonist in Southern California, had no new ideas or information to offer frustrated investigators, except to say hurry up, because it was only a matter of time before this arsonist would feel compelled to strike again, no matter the risk of discovery. And in the meantime, the Glendale Fire Department had plenty to do, putting out the brush fires that were burning up the surrounding dry fields and hillsides, along with a suspicious fire that had burned down a stage set at Warner Brothers studio in Burbank. The fire at Warner Brothers happened on November 22, 1991, a full 7 months after the Pillow Pyro Task Force had identified its new suspect. If, as John suspected, that fire had actually been the work of that suspect, it meant that their serial arsonist was back in business. And in the end, as John had predicted, it was the arsonist's growing need to go to the scene of the fires they had set that led to the suspect's capture and arrest. Just 1 day after the fire at the Warner Brothers studio, the suspect popped up on the scene of 2 separate arson fires before the location of the fires had become public knowledge, even for someone listening in on an emergency frequency scanner. And by December 4th, 1991, task force investigators were knocking on the door of the so-called Pillow Pyro serial arsonist, whose crimes now included the destruction of millions of dollars worth of property and business revenue, and the fire-related deaths of 4 people back in the fall of 1984 at Ollie's. Based on police interviews and evidence discovered in the suspect's car and home, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night of October 10, 1984, at Ollie's Home Center in South Pasadena, and here is how the arsonist was able to go from that night and set thousands more additional fires throughout Southern California. Back on a cool, clear night in early October 1984, the arsonist stepped through the front doors of Ollie's Home Center on Fair Oaks Boulevard. But before setting the fire they had planned so carefully, the arsonist allowed themselves the pleasure of walking through the store aisles and enjoying the open space plan of the building. Not only was this home center filled with material that would catch fire quickly and burn very hot, it had a fire containment system that the arsonist was sure they could hijack in a way that would cause even more terror and destruction. If the plan the arsonist had in mind worked, then the floor-to-ceiling fire doors that were designed to contain a fire that happened after hours when no one was in the store would come down very quickly and maybe even trap inside the burning building some of the customers the arsonist now saw wandering through the aisles. Those customers included a middle-aged woman and a young boy who probably wasn't even 3 years old yet. The arsonist fingered the incendiary device inside of their pocket. It was simple and elegant, and just feeling the cigarette and matches rubber-banded together inside of the piece of rolled-up yellow notepad paper gave the arsonist a thrill of sexual excitement. After planting the device inside of a display of polyurethane cushions, the arsonist would make sure there was just the right combination of air supply and fuel before lighting the cigarette. Then, the arsonist would have 10 to 15 minutes to stroll casually out of the store before the matches and paper caught fire and transferred that small but hot flame into the surrounding foam. But before setting the cigarette alight, the arsonist spent just 1 minute full of secret pleasure, imagining the trajectory of the fire they were about to create and control. 45 seconds after the polyurethane caught fire, the flames from the cushions would race up the wall behind the display. Then, the 1,000-degree heat would push its way across the ceiling and walls and melt the door locks that would in turn trigger the roll down of the north and south floor-to-ceiling fire doors. Maybe the woman and the little boy would be trapped inside of one of those areas. The arsonist could imagine the woman pulling the little boy out of the shopping cart and holding on to him as she looked down the aisles around her and saw flames boiling out towards where she was standing. There might be other people trapped in the store, employees and would-be heroes who would understand too late that what they thought was a little smoke was in fact a raging inferno, and they would try to get everyone who was still in the store outside. But they would be too late. By the time the fire shorted out all the lights, it would also burn through the ceiling into the attic, where the hot flames would find a fresh source of oxygen that would cause the fire to become even more intense and even more deadly. And by the time the first fire engine arrived, the firefighters would also be too late. The arsonist would have exposed the fatal flaw in the store's fire containment system by starting a fire so hot that the automatic roll down of the fire doors would actually prevent people from getting out and making it impossible for firefighters to rescue anyone trapped inside. The arsonist had also made sure that the emergency response, at least at first, would be inadequate, because the arsonist had set 2 other fires that evening, one that broke out at a food market in Pasadena just before 7 p.m., and another that would ignite any minute now in a display of oil-saturated potato chips at a food market just 6 blocks away. Those fires would be nothing, though, not compared to the one that was about to engulf Ole's home center. The other 2 were just diversionary fires, ones that would mean fewer fire engines would be available to respond to the truly magnificent fire that the arsonist was about to set right now. Glancing around to make sure that no one could see what they were doing, the arsonist carefully, lovingly, lit the cigarette nestled inside its yellow paper in the nest of highly flammable polyurethane foam cushions. A moment later, as he passed through the paint department, the arsonist smiled at a young woman behind the counter who was handing a set of house keys over to an older woman who must have been the younger woman's mother. A minute or 2 after that, Glendale Fire Department's crack arson investigator, John Orr, a man later known as the Pillow Pyro, left Ole's home center through the front door. John had already been to the site of the first fire he'd set that evening, a food market in Pasadena. He had stayed there just long enough to take a few pictures and impress everyone at the scene with his uncanny ability to detect exactly how the fire started. In that case, he had led the store owner over to the potato chip display and explained how quickly a fire could feed off the oil-soaked snack food. Now, John figured he had just enough time to check in on the progress of the second diversionary fire he'd set in another shelf of potato chips at a little grocery a few blocks away from Ole's. Then he would come back here in time to watch the main attraction, the total destruction of this hardware store and everything inside of it. And sure enough, by 8:30 p.m., John was standing again in the parking lot outside of Ole's home center, watching and taking pictures with his 35mm camera, even as the flames sent a tower of sparks high into the night sky, and the entire roof of the 18,000 square foot building collapsed inward. Standing near John was Billy Deal, whose wife and grandson were trapped inside of the burning building. Billy was still standing there when the sister of Carolyn Krause, the young woman who had been standing behind the counter in the paint department when John had left the hardware store at about 10 minutes before the fire broke out, approached John. When she told him that her sister Carolyn was still missing, John glanced away from the viewfinder of his camera just long enough to tell her that once they went in to look for bodies, they'd be sure to keep an eye out for Carolyn. When state investigators arrived at John's house to arrest him 7 years later on the afternoon of December 4th, 1991, they found a black canvas bag belonging to John that contained rubber bands, matches, a pack of cigarettes, and 2 cigarette lighters. And under the floor mat behind the driver's seat in the city car John drove, investigators recovered a pad of yellow-lined notepaper. But it would turn out investigators had already discovered the key pieces of evidence that would eventually put one of California's most respected arson investigators behind bars. The problem was they had dismissed those early clues as just too unbelievable to pursue, and possibly too damaging to their own public image. Because, going all the way back to 1987, Captain Marvin Casey from the Bakersfield Fire Department had had very solid grounds for suspecting that the wave of fires, first in the Fresno area and 2 years later in the Pacific Grove area, were the work of a professional firefighter. Because when Marvin had mapped out the time and location of those fires, he had discovered that each wave was clustered around a regional conference attended by state arson investigators, including John Orr. And once investigators had recovered the partial fingerprint from one of the crime scenes, Marvin was able to narrow his list of possible suspects down to just 10 investigators, and that list included John and 9 others who had attended both the 1987 and 1989 conferences, which meant each of the people on the list had been in the general location of the fires, and each had traveled to and from the conferences alone, which meant they would have had the opportunity to set the fires without anyone seeing them. But due to a mistake at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Crime Lab, crime techs failed to match the recovered print to the print they had on file for John Orr. It was a mistake that would allow John to continue setting fires for another 4 years. It wasn't until April 17, 1991, after the head of the Pillow Pyro Task Force had requested that the crime lab run the fingerprint again, this time against the prints on file for all Los Angeles law enforcement personnel, that the crime lab came up with a match. Back in 1971, 3 years before John was hired by the Glendale Fire Department, John had almost realized his true lifelong dream, that of becoming a Los Angeles police officer. John had passed all the physical, oral, and medical exams, his fingerprints were on file, and then came the bitter and devastating news. He had failed the psychological evaluation. According to the Los Angeles Police Department psychologist, John was a schizoid person who was withdrawn and who had issues with women and sex. Bottom line diagnosis: personality trait disturbance, and an emotionally unstable personality. Exactly the kind of man who would later leave the print from his left ring finger on an incendiary device recovered on January 16, 1987, from the site of a fire at the Family Bargain Center in Tulare, just south of Fresno, where state arson investigators, including John, were attending an annual conference. But important as that matching fingerprint would be in the court case against John Orr, there was another piece of evidence that John himself handed over to investigators on a silver platter. That piece of evidence was the manuscript of a fact-based book John was writing about an arsonist who lived in the Los Angeles area and whose crimes bore striking similarities to actual events in John's own life. John had started writing the book back in 1990, and it wasn't long before he was sending out letters to editors and publishers asking if they would buy it. At the request of the Pillow Pyro Task Force, a former firefighter turned published author reached out to John and offered assistance. John sent him the manuscript, which later wound up in the hands of the task force. Instead of reading like the fact-based thriller John claimed it was, the manuscript read like John's own autobiography. The giveaway was how accurately John described real arson cases that he himself had not investigated. The only way he could have known so many details that had been withheld from the public or left out of official accounts was if John himself had set the fires that he had written about. In particular, John wrote a detailed description of his protagonist, a serial arsonist, setting fire to a hardware store in South Pasadena called Cal's, a fire that in the manuscript wound up killing 5 people, including a grandmother and her 2.5-year-old grandson, a little boy named Matthew. In his book, which John titled Points of Origin, a phrase that refers to the starting point of a fire, his arsonist was furious when investigators declared the hardware fire was accidental. Just as John in real life had wanted the Los Angeles arson cop investigating the real-life fire at Ole's home center on October 10, 1984, to recognize that conflagration as the brilliant work of a gifted serial arsonist. In particular, John wanted the credit he felt he deserved for the skill and artistry that he had put into creating a fire that burned so hot and fast that in the end, not everyone could escape the flames. Instead, the official report listed John's perfect arson as accidental. And in real life, John would spend the next 7 years after the fire at Ole's hardware store drawing as much attention as possible to his theory that all of these fires had been set by a serial arsonist who turned out to be none other than himself. John knew that back in 1989, he had been very lucky when the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had failed to match that fingerprint found at an arson scene to John's own fingerprint. But what John had said about a real pyro not being able to stop setting fires turned out to be true of John himself. Even after he discovered the tracking device that had been installed under his car bumper, and he knew that he was a suspect in the Pillow Pyro investigation, ultimately John could not control his own compulsion. And by 1990 through 1991, he practically set entire areas of Southern California on fire. Right up until the moment in late November 1991, when even John could not explain how he managed to appear immediately on the scene of so many fires before anyone else even knew those fires had started to burn. Starting with his first trial on arson charges in 1992, John would face a total of 3 state and federal trials. By 1998, John would be convicted of a total of 4 murder charges and 23 counts of arson. He is currently serving a life sentence at California State Prison. Before John's arrest in 1991, the number of brush fires in the foothill areas near John's home in Los Angeles had averaged 67 every year dating back to 1981. After John's arrest, that number dropped to just 1 brush fire a year in that same area. When arson investigators conducted a similar survey of arson fires in retail stores during business hours going back 10 years, they determined that most of the 78 fires they found that matched those criteria had probably also been set by John Orr. In total, California law enforcement would eventually attribute as many as 2,000 fires in Southern California set between 1984 and 1991 to John Orr, the so-called Pillow Pyro. Our major source of information for creating this episode was Joseph Wambaugh's nonfiction book titled Fire Lover, published in 2002. We also relied on the documentaries, court records, and historical newspaper articles you can find on our source list provided in the description. Mount Fuji is the highest mountain in Japan, rising up to 3,776 meters, and it's actually a volcano. It's dormant. The last time it erupted was in 1707, but geologists still classify it as active. Tourists are allowed to climb Mount Fuji, but only between July and September, because in the winter months, the mountain gets completely treacherous. There's snow and ice, and the wind picks up. It's very, very dangerous, so it's off limits. Now, thrill seekers, if they really wanted to, they could climb Mount Fuji in the winter, because there isn't a security guard posted up at the bottom of Mount Fuji checking people in and out. It's on you. If you want to climb it when it's off limits, well, then you're climbing at your own risk, because basically it's a terrible idea. But if you have the right equipment and you have all the right training, it is doable. One thrill seeker, a 47-year-old named Tetsu, decided he wanted to hike Mount Fuji in the winter of 2019. He wanted to live stream his entire journey to the summit. Now, Tetsu might have been a thrill seeker, but he certainly wasn't a mountain climber. He did not have the experience, nor did he have any of the equipment necessary for a climb up Mount Fuji in the winter. Wearing only street clothes and carrying nothing more than climbing poles and his smartphone, he turned on his live stream and he began hiking up the Shubashiri Trail. Viewers began tuning in as Tetsu happily made his way up this ash-covered trail, and then the ash turned into light snow, and then light snow turned into really heavy snow and ice and wind. And then Tetsu began complaining about how cold he was and how he couldn't feel his hands, and his viewers are egging him on to, keep going, keep pushing through it. And probably because of the pressure he felt from his viewers, he kept going when really this would have been the moment to turn around. When you're realizing that you don't have the right equipment and it's getting really cold and you're probably not even halfway up, that's the time to turn around. But he didn't. He pressed on. As he moved up the mountain, the path he was on continued to narrow and become increasingly more covered in ice, and the guard fence that straddled the side of this path was getting to the place where it comes to a stop, signaling the most dangerous section of the hike, which is the last leg up to the summit. He gets to that point where the fence comes to an end, and now he's on this narrow stretch where the wind is just whipping across and it's all ice, and he's trying to walk across the ice with this totally inappropriate footwear. He should have had on at least crampons, the metal spikes that go on the bottom of your shoe to grip ice. He just had tennis shoes on, and so he's slipping and sliding as he's walking up this icy trail, and then he finally staggers and falls, but he catches himself. And you can hear him laughing on the live stream, joking with his audience how dangerous and slippery it is. And his viewers begin to change their tone a little bit. And they're like, hey, you might want to consider turning around now. But Tetsu is totally focused on getting to the top. So he stands back up and he continues to kind of shuffle his way towards the summit on this stretch of ice. He finally gets right up below the summit to where on his live stream you can actually see the top of Mount Fuji. And you can tell that his footwear at this point is basically not able to handle how slick it is. He's basically constantly stumbling. And you can see he notices a little stretch of small rocks that seem to almost make stepping stones up to the summit. And he begins walking over very carefully on the ice to try to use these rocks to get himself up to the top. And right as he's trying to step for one of these rocks, he loses his balance. And on camera, he says, wait, I'm slipping. And then he falls and begins rocketing down the side of this mountain. Now, when you fall on a steep mountain, you have one, maybe two chances to self-arrest. So, for example, if you had an ice pick and you were like Tetsu and you start falling, you would want to roll over and dig the head of that ice pick into the ground and basically anchor your knees and elbows and drive everything you can into the snow to stop yourself from falling. And so if you can't do that in one or two attempts, your momentum will pick up and you'll be going too fast and you won't be able to stop yourself. And then you just got to hope you survive the fall. Tetsu did not have an ice pick or any other tool to help him self-arrest, and he didn't have the training for what to do in a situation like this, so he didn't even attempt to roll over and dig his elbows or knees into the ground to try to slow down. So he just goes flying down the mountain, he's on his back, he's not slowing down, and he knows he's doomed. And he says on camera, well, it can't be helped, before he flies over the edge and falls hundreds of meters down to his death. His viewers who watched this happen alerted authorities, who found his body the next day over 1,000 meters away from where he had first fallen. Every year, there is a handful of people that attempt to climb Mount Fuji in the winter, and they meet the same fate.
Our next story is called Into the Wild.
On September 6, 1992, two moose hunters that were hunting just outside of Denali National Park in Alaska were walking up to a well-known landmark amongst hunters in the area. It was this old school bus that was parked in the middle of nowhere. It was all rusted over and nature had practically overgrown it. And hunters, trappers, and travelers would use this bus as kind of like a center point that you would reference where you were going relative to this particular bus. But when they walked up to it, they saw on the outside of the door that there was a note. Attention possible visitors, SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is not a joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you, Chris McCandless. Dated August ? 5 months earlier, in April of 1992, Chris McCandless, the one who wrote that note, had hitchhiked from Carthage, South Dakota to Fairbanks, Alaska. Once there, he hitchhiked again with an electrician named Jim Gallion, who was making his way out of Fairbanks. Chris introduced himself as Alex and asked Jim if he would take him to Denali National Park, which was about 2 hours away to the southwest. On the drive, Jim asked Chris what he was going to be doing at the park, because this is like wild Alaska country, and frankly, Chris did not look like a rugged Alaskan outdoorsman. Chris told Jim that he was going to be living off the land for a few months. Jim would later say that he had serious doubts about Chris's ability to survive in the Alaskan bush. As it was, Chris only had a light backpack, did have a rifle, but he really didn't have warm clothes on. He only had 10 pounds of rice. That was the only thing he brought for food. He didn't have a compass. He didn't have a map. He didn't have a watch. He just seemed totally ill-equipped for what he was saying he was going to go do. At some point, Jim tried to convince Chris not to go, or to at least postpone, and he even offered, hey, I'll drive you up to Anchorage and I'll buy you equipment. You need the right equipment for what you're going to be doing. Let's go there first. But Chris was stubborn, and so Jim ultimately relented and said, okay. He drove him to the park. Before Chris left, Jim actually gave him a pair of warm boots that he had in his truck. He said, "Here, you can use these more than I can." And Chris thanked him, took his boots, and he was on his way. Although Chris was planning for this extensive hike through Denali National Park all the way to the Bering Sea, Chris would only make it about 20 miles into his journey before stopping at an old rusted bus just outside of the park. Chris would live in this bus for 16 weeks, and according to his diary, that first week he was there was particularly rough. He was snowed in, he couldn't catch anything to eat, so he's hungry and cold. But shortly thereafter, he developed a routine. He was able to hunt successfully for some small game. He found some plants that were good to eat, and by and large, his entries made it seem like he was very happy. However, the last month of diary entries really painted a very different picture. After living in this bus for nearly 3 months, he indicated in his diary that he was kind of sick and tired of living off the land and he was ready to return back to society. So on July 3rd, he packs up his camp and he starts walking back the 20 miles towards where he came into the park in the first place. But when he came into the park 3 months earlier, the river that he was going to need to cross was frozen. And now that he's returning in the summer, it had thawed, and now it's the 75-foot wide raging river that was basically impossible to cross. And so he's trapped on the wrong side of this river. What he didn't know, because he didn't have a compass, he didn't have a map, he didn't know the area well, was there was actually a hand-operated tram that would take you across the river in the summer. It was only a mile away from his camp that was labeled on almost every map. In addition, there was a hunting cabin not far from that tram that's also on just about every map of this particular area. That had food, it had clothes, it had bedding. He could have stayed in this hunting cabin until conditions were okay again to make the journey back home. But again, he doesn't have a map, so he doesn't know these things exist. So at some point, he turns around and goes back to the bus, feeling totally dejected. That night, his journal entry just said, "Reined in, river looks impossible, lonely, scared." All of Chris's diary entries following his return to the bus after not being able to cross this river got shorter and bleaker and really painted a picture of a guy that was going downhill. The final entry in Chris's diary just says, "Beautiful blue berries." And then 19 days after his final entry is when those two moose hunters find this bus and see the note, the SOS note, pinned to the outside. The hunters go inside the bus, and there, laying in a sleeping bag, is the body of Christopher McCandless. Although it's not entirely clear how Christopher actually died, the two most common theories are either starvation or perhaps he ingested a poisonous plant seed. The hunters alerted authorities who came out and they launched an investigation, and during this investigation they found Chris's camera. Chris was an avid photographer. He had taken loads of pictures over the course of his stay out in the wild, and so he took one last dignified picture of himself before curling up in his sleeping bag and passing away.
Our next story is called One-Way Trip.
Bryce Gillies was born in 1989 in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. From a young age, Bryce's parents knew he loved the outdoors, and so they signed him up for the Boy Scouts. And as a scout, Bryce learned, amongst many things, how to survive in the wilderness. And he would routinely put this training to the test by leaving his house and heading off to the nearby Appalachian Trail and hiking around sometimes up to 20 miles in a single day. Bryce ultimately became an Eagle Scout, which is the highest rank anybody can obtain inside of the Boy Scouts, a rank that only about 8% of scouts will ever reach. After he graduated from high school in 2007, Bryce decided he wanted to go to school out west. And during a visit to Northern Arizona University, Bryce fell in love with their school because all around their campus were these unbelievable hiking trails that were totally unlike anything he saw growing up on the East Coast. Bryce decided this was his dream school, so he applied, and a couple weeks later, he got accepted. He was totally thrilled. During his first couple of years at NAU, Bryce took full advantage of these totally amazing hiking trails within a couple hours of the campus. He also spent some time overseas in West Africa, helping to build a medical clinic for people in need. During the summer break of 2009, so going into his third year at NAU, Bryce was still living out in Arizona in an apartment, and he still had a few weeks before classes started. And so he decided he would head off to the nearby Grand Canyon to do a little bit of hiking. He had recently read in an outdoor magazine about this lesser-known but unbelievable trail that was just for experts in the canyon that he wanted to try. It was called the Deer Creek Thunder River Loop, and it brought hikers to this remote location where water gushed out of this huge limestone rock wall, transforming the desert landscape below into this unbelievable green oasis. The article said very strong hikers could complete this nearly 28-mile loop in about 3 days. Since Bryce considered himself a very strong hiker, he decided this was perfect for him. Bryce called his parents and let them know he was going to do this loop and that when he came back in a couple of days, he'd be making a trip to Virginia to visit with them. Then Bryce called some friends in the area to see if they wanted to come with him on this hike, but no one was available, so Bryce decided he would go on his own. So the next day, which was Saturday, July 18th, Bryce loaded up his car and he began driving these several hours to the parking lot that was nearest the trailhead. Bryce parked his car, he got his gear out of the trunk, and then he set off down the trail. Bryce had not obtained a backcountry permit for this hike. This was a requirement for anybody doing an overnight out in the canyon, which Bryce planned on doing. Bryce also didn't file his route with the park rangers. Had he told them where he was going, they would have tried to talk him out of it. The Deer Creek Thunder River Loop had no protection from the sun the entire time, and since it was July, he would be hit with the highest temperatures and the most direct sunlight. All this on top of the fact that even in the coolest times of the year, this trail is still an extremely difficult trail because of the terrain you have to navigate. In fact, when hikers did file their route with park rangers and they indicated they were going to be doing this expert loop, they would ask them to provide next of kin information in case they died during their hike. It's unclear if Bryce was just very confident in himself and his abilities, or if he was being reckless. From his car, Bryce hiked about 2 miles down some switchbacks into the canyon. Once he reached the bottom, he would have found himself in this wide open flat area called the Esplanade that kind of looked like the surface of the moon with all these potholes all over it. At this point in Bryce's hike, it would have been dark out, so he would have set up his tent somewhere on the rocks and camped out for the night. People that have done this, that have camped out on the Esplanade, have said it's unbelievably beautiful because most people experience the Grand Canyon from high up on one of the rims looking down into it. But the Esplanade is literally inside the canyon, so you have this unobstructed view in both directions, and apparently it's quite beautiful. The next morning, Bryce got up at sunrise, he packed up his campsite, and then he continued on his hike. The first challenge he would come up against that morning was navigating down what's called the Red Wall, which is a fairly steep and treacherous descent that for an experienced hiker, it would take about an hour to safely navigate. And then at the bottom of the Red Wall, you would enter into this area called the Surprise Valley. No one really knows why it's named that, but hikers who have been down in this valley, they think it's named after the surprise you feel when you get in there and you realize how much hotter it is. Typically, it's about 10 or 20 degrees hotter down inside of this bowl. After Bryce successfully navigated down the Red Wall, he entered into this totally miserable Surprise Valley, but he would have known he was only about a half mile away from his target destination, the Deer Creek Thunder River, where he planned to jump in and cool off. So, eager to do that, Bryce took off, but made a critical mistake. He went the wrong way. While it's unclear exactly how this happened, experts believe his ears played a trick on him. Hikers are told as they're approaching this river in the middle of the desert, they should listen out for it, because when you get fairly close, you can hear the sound of rushing water. But hikers have to be careful because sometimes when the wind is blowing in a certain direction, that sound from the river will echo off the inside of this bowl and it will appear to come from the opposite direction. It's believed Bryce was following his map when he heard the sound of this river coming from a different direction, and so he abandoned the map and followed the sound. Bryce walked for quite a while in the wrong direction all the way up a hill, and most likely the whole time he was hearing the sound of the water, and he probably thought, once I get over the top of this hill, I'll look down the other side and I will see the water. But when he crested the hill, he looked down and just saw a barren valley. Had he continued another quarter mile down into the valley and then up the other side, he could have turned around and he would have been able to spot an obvious landmark that would have brought him to the river. But most likely, Bryce was exhausted from the extreme heat and the sunlight and trekking all this way, and so he felt like it was probably too risky to keep going down into this valley because he had no idea where it went. So in keeping with his wilderness training he got as a Boy Scout, he dropped all of his heavy equipment off the side of the trail in an area he had marked so he could eventually come back and retrieve it. And then he took his water, food, and headlamp, turned around, and began backtracking. After a little while, Bryce decided to abandon the trail and actually veer off onto a dry creek bed. In the Boy Scouts, they're taught any dry creek bed will eventually connect to water. And so at this point, Bryce is probably running low on water and figures whether this leads him to the Deer Creek Thunder River or some other water body, he didn't care. He just needed water. So off he went on this dry creek bed, but after a while, he saw less and less vegetation. It was just this barren desert in all directions. After a little while longer, Bryce dropped all of his gear on the ground after finishing his water. At this point, he would have known that if he doesn't find a water source soon, he won't make it. And so Bryce just continues to trudge along on this dry riverbed, not seeing any indication that he's getting any closer to water. But then he looks up and he sees the land in front of him appears to slope downward out of view. And then beyond that, he sees off in the distance what looks like the southern wall of the Grand Canyon. And below the southern wall is the Colorado River. And so Bryce would have known if he can just go down this decline, he's certain to reach this river and he'll be saved. And so Bryce made his way up to where the ground started going down towards the river, and he began safely descending fairly slowly, and then he reached a very steep section called a spill, which is a dry waterfall, and these vary in height, but they're pretty steep and they're pretty slick. Once Bryce went down one of these things, there'd be no way to get back up again. So this was a one-way trip. But Bryce was desperate. He knew his only chance was getting down to that Colorado River, which he could now see. And so Bryce scrambled down this first spill, and then he found another one, and he kept going down these spills, and they kept getting steeper and more challenging, and the temperature continued to rise as he went down deeper into this canyon. Finally, Bryce reached a spill that was very, very steep, and it was nearly vertical. But again, Bryce couldn't go back up the way he came. He had to keep going. So at some point, he threw himself off of this spill, and he fell down 30 feet, but he lived. He stood up, he dusted himself off, and he continued walking forward. He walked past these boulders into this clearing, and right in front of him is the Colorado River. It's a half a mile straight down in front of him. But the only way to get to it was navigating another spill. And this spill was 80 feet tall, and it was almost completely vertical. There was no way to survive that kind of fall. And Bryce couldn't just turn around and try to find an alternate route because this was a one-way trip. He could not climb back up the spills he had just come down to get there. And to his left and to his right were these steep canyon walls that kind of bordered the space he was in that had no handholds on them, so he couldn't climb them up or down. Bryce was trapped, and he knew it. The following Tuesday, when Bryce was supposed to be home in Virginia visiting his family, he didn't show up. So his family tried calling him, but they couldn't get through to him. It seemed like his phone was off, and so they called the authorities. A search party was sent out in the Grand Canyon to go look for Bryce, and on Saturday, July 25th, so this is 6 days after Bryce has found himself trapped on that ledge overlooking the river, a search party was on the Colorado River, and they happened to look up in the direction where Bryce had been, and they noticed what looked like a person, and so they got their climbing gear, and they made their way up that spill onto this ledge, and they found Bryce. He was sitting up against a boulder, and he was deceased. He had died from heat stroke and dehydration. In his hand was his BlackBerry cell phone. It wouldn't have had any service inside of the canyon, but Bryce used it as a notepad to write a final message to his family and to his friends. In it, he writes, "Life is good whether it is long or short. I was fortunate to do much more than most people, and for that I am very thankful." His message also had some humor thrown into it. He said to his family that he was really thankful he had his BlackBerry phone because it would have been a lot harder to etch his final message into a rock. He also said that he didn't know what the afterlife held for him, he just hoped they had water. Then, with his phone's battery dying, he wrote one final sentence. "I feel like going into the wild is a calling we all feel. Some answer it, and some die for it." Then, shortly after writing that message, Bryce clutched his phone to his chest, and he passed away. He was just 20 years old.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Gates of the Arctic.
Growing up in Oklahoma, Blake Stanfield loved going out in the wilderness with his father, Neil. The pair were more like best friends than father and son, and they spent as much time together as they possibly could. But by the time Blake was in his 30s, he had become a medical doctor, and so he was really busy, and he was married, and he had a young kid, and so he didn't see his father very much. And then in 2003, when Blake was 38, he moved his family to Alaska, and so he really didn't see his father anymore. But shortly after moving, Blake had an idea. He wanted to surprise his dad on his 65th birthday with a rafting trip in Alaska. It was going to be this great way for the two to reconnect with each other. When he broke the news to his father, Neil was really touched by it and very excited, but at the same time, he was a little bit apprehensive, and he asked his son, are we going in a group? Is this going to be a guided rafting trip? And Blake said, oh no, that's the wrong way to do this. We will not have a good time if we go with a group. We're doing this alone. And so Neil said, well, isn't that a little bit risky, just the two of us out in the middle of Alaska? And Blake said, don't worry, I've picked a river that by Alaskan standards is considered leisurely, so we'll be just fine. Neil was still hesitant about it, but the two of them were very competent outdoorsmen, and so ultimately he just went along with it. So later that year, in early July, Blake and Neil took a float plane out to the Gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska. This park is totally beautiful, but it's also very dangerous because it's full of grizzly bears and wolves, and it's also very remote. There's no people anywhere near this park. It's basically untouched wilderness. Adding to the isolation and danger, Blake and Neil did not have their cell phones or a radio. It was Blake's idea. He said it would be a good idea for us to just totally disconnect and just spend quality time together. And then also, Blake had chosen a starting point on this river that was situated basically right in the middle of the park, which meant it was 60 miles away from the nearest human settlement. So after they got dropped off by this float plane, and then the captain of that plane took off again, Blake and Neil loaded their stuff into their raft, and then they hopped in, and they started cruising down this river. At first, their trip was awesome. The weather was perfect, the landscape was beautiful, the water was totally calm, and Neil, he might have had reservations about the safety of this trip, but quickly he was overcome with just how peaceful it was, and how wonderful it was to be with just his son out on the open water. And in fact, Blake had intentionally booked this trip 2 weeks before the start of the official rafting season in Alaska, which meant really there was nobody else in the water. It was just those two. And they thought, wow, what luck. Except it turns out there's a very specific reason why the rafting season starts when it does in Alaska. Because that's the earliest the ice melts in the river and it becomes safe to travel on. After 2 hours of peace and tranquility out on this river, Blake and Neil started to notice these large ice chunks in the water ahead of them. And they were easy enough to get around, but as they kept moving, the current was picking up and these ice chunks got bigger and bigger until they started being these huge sheets all across the edges of the river where there was only a narrow strip of water they could travel through. And at some point, Neil asked Blake if it would be a good idea to just pull the raft over to the side of the river and get out and reassess the situation and see if we've reached an anomaly in the river where just this section is frozen, or if this is going to continue for a lot farther, and if so, we need to make alternative plans here. But Blake was not having it. He was stubborn, he wanted to keep going, and he was convinced he could maneuver the boat around the ice. And he said, let's just keep going a little bit farther. And so when they went a little bit farther, they reached a point where the current was so strong that they could no longer get out of the river. They had to ride it like a rapid until it stopped. And so as the father and son are fighting with each other about not having gotten out of the river while they still had a chance, they were not paying attention to what was in front of them, and they came around a corner and there was this huge ice shelf that was right across the whole river that basically blocked the whole path. And they turned at the last second. They couldn't do anything either way, but the nose of the raft went directly under the ice shelf and it flipped the raft onto its side, dumping Neil and Blake into frigid Alaskan waters underneath the ice shelf. And Blake would later say that he really believed that this was it. He didn't know how far this ice shelf was going to go on for, and so he assumed, I'm about to drown. But they managed to hit this air pocket inside of this ice shelf. The ice basically formed up at a bow, and they both happened to pop up into it, and they gripped onto the ice. and they're looking at each other and they have no idea how long this ice shelf continues, but the current is pulling them and they know it's just a matter of time before they get sucked under and go back under the ice. And so they look at each other and they don't really know what to say, but it's kind of obvious that they think they're about to drown. And then at some point, Neil gets sucked under and swept away, and then Blake follows shortly after. And then fortunately, they only tumbled along for about 10 or 15 more feet before they popped up again. But much like the boat that could not paddle out of the river because of how strong the current was, Blake and Neil could not get out of the river in time before they hit yet another ice shelf. And the next ice shelf was much longer than the first. And so they knew it was going to happen. They grabbed onto the ice shelf and they're holding on and they're trying to pull themselves back out, but the current's too strong. And at some point, they each had to take a big breath and then let go and got pulled directly under the ice. And so the whole time they're pressing their face up against the underside of this ice in hopes they find an air pocket, but they don't. And so the whole time they're just desperately looking for air and they're bumping into the underside of the ice. They have no idea how long it's going to go on for. And so after what felt like an eternity, Blake finally gets shot out the backside of this huge ice shelf. And he's still in the river, but there's no more ice shelves in front of him. And the current had slowed down a little bit. So he was able to make his way to the edge and get out of the water. And he turned to face the water and his dad was nowhere to be found. And so Blake turns and he doesn't see his father coming out of the ice. He doesn't know if he's still under, if he came out again. And so he turns and runs downstream in hopes that he might have come out already. And sure enough, he found his dad clutching a rock in the middle of this river farther up. His head was badly bleeding, but he was alive. And so Blake grabbed a stick and was able to bring his father back into shore. Even though they had survived being pulled under the ice, they now had no equipment, no gear, no food, no water, no anything because it was pulled under the water. And they were soaking wet and becoming hypothermic. And they're in the middle of nowhere with no one nearby to help them. And no one's expecting them for a week. And no planes are going to be in the area for 2 weeks. Fortunately, Blake had a lighter in his pocket that worked, and so they were able to start a fire and stay warm, and they were able to scare away grizzly bears and wolves. Blake finally walked away from their campsite, which was up on a mountain, and he went down to this river where he was able to flag down a float plane that was not even scheduled to be in the area. It was just totally random, and they saw Blake, they came back, they picked him up, and both men were just fine. They did say that even though the trip was a complete disaster and nearly killed both of them, it did reconnect them in a way that few things could, and their relationship is good as ever. But they both say they will never go rafting again.
All the walls are breathing slowly. Cracks like rivers trace the night. Shadows fold around the memory of a love that wouldn't die. I hear your name inside the static, a ghost that moves beneath the glass. Every silence turns cinema.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballin Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, just head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's